before I do the introduction, we have cookies and drinks up here if anybody would like to partake in them. Good afternoon and welcome to our first College of Liberal Arts Faculty Colloquium in the fall 2023 semester. Thank you all for attending today's presentation. My name is Adam Sizemore and I will be the moderator for today's talk and for each of the talks in the 2023 and 2024 academic year. Before we begin, I hand it over, I'd like to make a few comments here. If you have any questions for the speaker, we will reserve time at the end for a Q&A session. And if we have any students in the audience who wish to receive extra credit or if we're here for that purpose, please see me after the presentation and I will have a sign-up sheet. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kristin LaFollette, or known to her students as Dr. L. Dr. L is an assistant professor in the Department of English and an affiliated faculty in Gender and Sexuality Studies and Liberal Arts. She holds a Bachelor's and Master's of Arts in English and Creative Writing from Indiana University South Bend and a PhD in Rhetoric and Writing Studies from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Her research focuses on the rhetoric of health and medicine and the medical humanities. Her recent scholarship can be found in Across the Disciplines, Journal of Basic Writing, and Journal of Multimodal Rhetoric. She is also a member of the Board of Advisors at the Blood Project, an educational platform out of Harvard Medical School that works towards bridging the gap between evidence-based medicine and patient care, as well as the associate chair of the Medical Rhetoric Standing Group at the Conference of College Composition and Communication. To add to her accomplishments, Dr. L is also a poet and has published 2 collections of poetry, one titled Hematology in 2021 and the other titled Body Parts in 2018. And without further ado, the screen is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. That was lovely. I hope you all can hear me. Can everyone hear me in the back?
Yes.
No? Okay. All right. I did teach 4 classes already today, so my voice is like waning. So please let me know if I need to speak up. But I'm excited to present my research project to you all today, which is called Rehumanizing Rhetoric, Recuperative Ethos in Human Specimens, a case study of the Indiana Medical History Museum. So I was able to spend some time at the museum in Indianapolis this summer to do this research, and that trip was made possible by a CLAFTA, College of Liberal Arts Faculty research grant, development grant. So I'm grateful to the College of Liberal Arts for that support. Has anyone been to the Indiana Medical History Museum? Okay, awesome. Did you love it?
I love it.
Yes. It's a great experience. If you haven't been and you find yourself in Indianapolis at some point, I hope you go to the museum. I do have several pictures in the slideshow from the first time I went to the museum and learned about it, and then the second time when I went back to do research. This picture here is from the museum as well. This is just the door and the sign outside of the anatomical museum, which I'll talk about quite a bit more. But hopefully the pictures inspire you to take a trip to Indianapolis. It's a great little museum. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief story. And so this story is about Charles L. So Charles L. was born in 1866. He was a farmer, a husband, and a father, and he resided with his family in Cass County, Indiana. While those who knew him described him as a kind man, he began exhibiting aggressive behaviors at the age of 66 and was admitted to Central State Hospital, which is a psychiatric facility in Marion County, Indianapolis. Hospital staff attempted to learn more about his condition, theorizing that Charles' symptoms were the result of a head injury he sustained in a car accident in 1927. However, this theory couldn't be substantiated, obviously because they did not have the technology available at the time to do any kind of scans, and Charles' condition continued to decline until he passed away in 1936 at the age of 69. An autopsy revealed that his symptoms had not been caused by a brain injury, but by neurosyphilis, an infection that impacts the central nervous system, typically after many years of an undiagnosed or untreated syphilis infection. So the autopsy that determined the cause of Charles' symptoms took place at the pathological department, which was a separate facility that was still on the grounds of the Central State Hospital property. And the facility was established in 1896 to address growing concerns about the study and treatment of mental illness. The idea was that if more resources were invested into understanding, preventing, and treating mental illnesses, there would be less overcrowding and better educated staff at the hospital. And because of this new approach, Central State Hospital patients who passed away were sometimes sent to the pathological department on the same property to be studied. And families often consented to these autopsies because they were offered a free funeral in return and could only have had a proper funeral for their loved one if it was paid for. So when the facility, so the people who then came from the Central State Hospital who passed away, who came to the pathological department, practicing physicians, medical students, and mortuary students were invited to the pathological department to sort of witness these autopsies and learn from the procedures. And several of the specimens that were removed during these procedures were kept at the facility. And I have a picture of it that I'll show you in a minute, but the room at the Medical History Museum is set up basically like this one, even exactly like this table. It was part of it as well. It was kind of set up, it was a little bit more staggered so that people in the back could see up front. There was a table where the bodies would be autopsied so that everybody could see and learn what was happening. Okay, so, and several specimens were removed during those procedures and were kept at the facility. But when the facility closed and the building became the Indiana Medical History Museum in 1969, those specimens that were removed during those procedures became the basis of the Anatomical Museum, which you saw the doorway for in the first image, which is an exhibit at the museum that allows visitors to view the specimens alongside the clinical labels developed by the pathologists. So for example, a visitor could see Charles' brain with a description that read, 1936, male, age 69, general paralysis, psychosis with syphilitic meningoencephalitis. I practiced that a lot. The meninges have been removed to show the marked cortical atrophy. So that was, for many years, someone who was visiting the museum would go in, see the specimen, accompanied by that particular label. So in 2014, recognizing that visitors were not always acknowledging the humanity of the specimens and wanting to dignify the individuals represented by the specimens, the museum began their Rehumanizing the Specimens project. So this grant-funded project, which was led by Museum Executive Director Sarah Halter, and if she ends up watching this at some point in time, she allowed me to come do this research over the summer at the museum, and it's an excellent host, so thank you, Sarah, for that. And she was also assisted by a team of graduate students. And they worked for 5 years to develop labels for the 48 people represented by the specimens in the Anatomical Museum. So instead of focusing only on the clinical descriptions of the person's illness or injury, the team constructed a narrative of each person's lived experiences using a variety of resources, including hospital admission records, autopsy records, which were all still kept at the pathological department even when it became the museum, and newspapers and ancestry databases as well. So in 2019, the project was publicly unveiled, and visitors could then begin viewing the specimens alongside the original clinical labels and the newly developed narratives. So if you were to go to the museum now, you'd see all the same specimens with those same pathological labels, but also the new narratives are there as well. So using the Indiana Medical History Museum's Rehumanizing the Specimens project as a case study, this research project explores the impact of language on rehumanizing dehumanized individuals, like those represented by human specimen collections in medical museums. Specifically, I argued for the effectiveness of rehumanizing rhetoric, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and recuperative ethos, strategies employed by the Rehumanizing the Specimens project. In addition to offering suggestions for how these strategies can be adopted by other medical museums, I extend the discussion to healthcare providers applying what was learned from this case study also to the contemporary study and practice of medicine. And this picture here is so because my my research is really about the ethics of displaying human specimens. I do not have any images of the specimens in the slideshow. I just felt like that was the ethic. Well, actually, no, that's not true. I do have one, but it was donated a different way. But this is an image of just right outside the pathology building that shows like who was involved when it was first constructed. Okay, and this picture here is what I was talking about. So this room looks exactly like this. This is what it looked like back when it was being used for the purpose of doing the autopsies at the front of the room when everybody was watching and learning and asking questions. It still looks just like this. When I went for the first time to the museum in February of 2022, they put everyone who's there for a tour in this room first, and you kind of sit in there and take it all in and look at everything before the docent comes in to then take you around for the tour. But this is a really cool space. I have some other pictures of this in the slideshow as well. But before I move on, I want to define the key terms that I just mentioned. So that's rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos, and explain how I'm using them in this project. So rehumanizing rhetoric is a term I borrow from Emily Winderman and Jamie Landau, and it's a rhetorical process of pathos that effectively modulates public emotion to intervene upon a dehumanizing rhetorical ecology and return distinctly human attributes to patients. So that's their definition. I'll kind of break that down a little bit more. But similar to this concept of rehumanizing rhetoric is Catherine Malloy's concept of recuperative ethos, where individuals with mental illnesses use language to reestablish their place in the world and reestablish themselves as worthwhile and reliable speakers, thinkers, friends, and community members. So while Malloy's concept focuses specifically on individuals with mental illnesses, and while the people represented by the specimens at the museum were also treated for mental illnesses, I kind of apply recuperative ethos to a broader context in this research and use it to, it's a helpful concept to use for people who are experiencing dehumanization for other reasons, maybe not just associated with mental illness, or for people who wish to rehumanize individuals who can no longer speak for themselves, like the people represented by the specimens in the collection at the museum. So Winderman and Landau outline two strategies, including personification and rebuilding familial networks to rehumanize people who've had their humanity stripped from them. In personification, a person's distinctly human qualities are stressed. Rather than framing an individual as an object to be studied or treated, personification emphasizes that individual's personhood, and it makes it easier for others to then feel a connection to and empathy toward that individual when their humanity is stressed in that way. Rebuilding familial networks highlights the importance of each person's relationships and history, and using rehumanizing rhetoric to personify a dehumanized individual might involve underscoring their qualities, like if you were to say they were a creative person or they were a generous person, their lived experiences, maybe mentioning where they grew up or their occupation, or their interests and hobbies. In rebuilding familial networks, rehumanizing rhetoric stresses a person's role as a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, an aunt, or an uncle, and it also might involve outlining their cultural connections as well. And while recuperative ethos works toward rebuilding a person's credibility, it might overlap with rehumanizing rhetoric as some strategies, such as discussing a person's familial network, for instance, can appeal to both pathos and ethos at the same time. So, as Malloy writes, recuperative ethos reestablishes a person as a valued speaker, thinker, friend, and community member. And this process might include accentuating a person's education, maybe their occupation or work experience, or their family relationships. Also, their friendships could be part of this as well. But both rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos can serve as integral tools in the rehumanizing of individuals who have experienced devaluation. And this is demonstrated by the museum's Rehumanizing Specimens project. Okay, this one doesn't have a fun picture, but there are more, I promise. Using the museum's Rehumanizing the Specimens project as a case study, I engaged in observation and archival research to do this project. Particularly, the observations took place in the Anatomical Museum, which is that room that houses the specimen collection and the accompanying original labels and also the newly developed narratives. So the observations allowed me to view the specimens alongside the original clinical labels and the newly created narratives, and it gave me the opportunity to learn about the project's use of rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos, and consider its implications on, like, what does this project mean for other medical museums and contemporary practitioners of health and medicine. I also performed medical or archival research in the medical museum, using their archives and their digital archives, and this was necessary to learn more about the historical context of the museum, including its connections to the pathological department where the museum now is, and a central state hospital, and how the specimens came to be housed in the museum, which is, all of this is really what prompted the Rehumanizing the Specimen project in the first place. So the Anatomical Museum houses 52 specimens from autopsies performed between 1898 and 1948. So there's 52 specimens representing 48 individuals. And my results section in my project focused specifically on 5 individuals, each representing a different category of illness or injury. These categories, what you can see up here, these were developed by museum staff, and they include congenital defects, degenerative diseases, inflammation, miscellaneous trauma, tumors, and vascular circulatory. And because the congenital defects and miscellaneous categories only contain 1 specimen in each of those, I instead focused on the other categories that you can see here. And after viewing each specimen and the accompanying label and narrative, I chose this particular set of specimens, which you can see each specimen in the new narrative is referred to by their first name and last initial, and then it explains a little bit about what you're looking at in the actual specimen itself. But I chose these because of the diversity of their experiences inside and outside of Central State Hospital, and because of the richness of the narratives that the staff of the museum were able to put together. So I recorded my observations in the Anatomical Museum by taking photographs of the labels and narratives, and after I returned from my trip, I put everything into the same document, all of the text from the labels and narratives, creating separate sections in each document for each of the individuals listed here. And to analyze the observation data, I just highlighted areas, if any, where the narratives used rehumanizing rhetoric, recuperative ethos, or both. And when searching for instances of rehumanizing rhetoric, I followed Winderman and Landau and focused on personification and familial networks specifically. And I borrowed Malloy's coding scheme when searching for instances of recuperative ethos, and looked for references to astuteness and strong human connections, which you can see more about kind of how I set this up in this table. So before I talk about the results, I want to briefly discuss the labels and the narratives. So the clinical labels that originally accompanied the specimens in the museum, they're not inherently problematic, right? Because they were developed by pathologists for a specific audience, that's physicians, medical and mortuary students, and other pathologists, and for a specific purpose, which was to outline the autopsy findings, using specific language, which was medical terminology that they all spoke and understood, right? But when the audience and purpose and genre shifted, when the labels and specimens were placed in a new context at the museum, which seeks to educate a broader audience, the language of the labels was no longer accessible to many of the visitors. So separate from any identifying information and only accompanied by the clinical labels, the specimens easily became dehumanized. And rather than representing people, the specimens came to represent the specific illnesses or injuries that visitors could see in the specimen itself. So the narratives created as part of the Rehumanizing the Specimens project then used more accessible language to talk about each person's life. And these stories help visitors learn about historical understandings of illnesses and injuries, what treatments were available, and what life was like within and beyond the Central State Hospital. Like the clinical labels, the narratives discuss elements of each person's illness or injury, but they do so through storytelling and discussing the person's symptoms and treatments and hospital experiences. And the narratives also move beyond stories of illness or injury and include information about each person's lived experiences outside of the hospital. So what was their life like before they ended up at Central State Hospital? Okay, so in the interest of time, I talked about 5 individuals in my analysis, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to discuss 2 of those individuals, and then I'll provide a broader overview of the results. So the first individual that I will talk about is Nora S. She is represented by a brain specimen in the degenerative diseases category in the Anatomical Museum. So the clinical label that the pathologist put together said 1943, female, age 61, Alzheimer's disease, marked cortical atrophy most marked in front central region. There is relatively little atrophy in temporal lobe. Beginning of mental symptoms at age 56 with rapid mental deterioration, which was complete 2 years prior to death at age 61. So the newly developed narrative, on the other hand, engages rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos by noting that Nora's parents were German immigrants, which connects her to a specific cultural group, and that she lived in Indianapolis for most of her life. Recuperative ethos is used to outline Nora's educational experiences and her friendships. She studied at Butler University and went on to complete her graduate degree at Columbia. After her cognitive state began to change due to Alzheimer's, Nora received frequent visits at Central State Hospital from friends that she worked with in the school system in Indianapolis. And both rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos are used when discussing Nora's family relationships and work experience. She was the youngest of 6 children and spent much of her adult life living in her family's home with 2 of her siblings. And her sister also visited her frequently at Central State Hospital when she was a patient there. She served as an elementary and then high school teacher for over 30 years, and Nora passed away in 1943 from tuberculosis. So the second individual I'll talk about here is Edward C. So Edward is represented by a brain specimen in the vascular circulatory section of the Anatomical Museum. And the clinical label reads 1925, male, age 70, massive hemorrhage into basal ganglia and white matter of left hemisphere in patient with cerebral arteriosclerosis. So rehumanizing rhetoric in the narrative describes Edward's early life, saying that he was born in 1854 in Ohio and moved with his family to Indiana when he was 12 years old. Rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos established Edward as a dedicated worker and as a valued member of his family. He worked in a tile factory in Clinton County, Indiana. He had 10 siblings, got married at the age of 32, and had 7 children. When he started exhibiting symptoms like memory problems and hallucinations, in 1921, his family became greatly concerned, and he was admitted to Central State Hospital in 1922 and passed away 3 years later. But the autopsy results attributed his symptoms to cerebral arteriosclerosis, like I mentioned from the label, a disease that actually causes a hardening of the arteries in the brain. I think that's, no, I'm questioning myself, I think that's accurate. I've learned a lot about medical terminology doing this project. Make sure where I actually do show one of the specimens in the museum. But the difference between this one and if Sarah, the executive director, ends up watching this and I get this story wrong, I'm sorry. But what she had told me is that, well, all of the other specimens in this room came from people who were patients at Central State and then came to the pathology department and had autopsies performed. All of the specimens came from those people except for these 2 skeletons. These were given to the museum by a medical supply company. And we talked about this in my class earlier today. So for those of you who are in for that discussion, I think things were probably a little bit different back then than they are now in terms of body brokering, but hopefully these were ethically obtained specimens. Okay, so because the Rehumanizing the Specimens team had access to limited resources and sometimes couldn't find much information about certain individuals, The personal information in each narrative isn't extensive, but the team was able to discover and include some personal information about each of the individuals. So the narratives, even when sparse, work toward returning a sense of humanity to the specimens. So common ways of engaging rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos included outlining where these individuals grew up or where they live as adults, their familial networks and relationships with family members, and their occupations or work experiences. So while the full names of the individuals represented by the specimens would have been available in the records used to create the narratives, the people are only identified by their first name and last initial, as I mentioned. And this provides another layer of privacy and dignity for those individuals, which only works to further rehumanize them. And as mentioned previously, the specimens were often obtained by unethical means, which is why I didn't want to include any of the images here. But they're still available to view in the museum, obviously, with the labels and the narratives. I highly suggest it. I think it's like $10 to go get a tour there. I can't remember. But you gotta go, though. It's a great experience. But while families consented to the autopsies, it was typically only because they were offered a free funeral for their loved one that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford. And like I mentioned earlier, this is really what prompted the Rehumanizing the Specimens project in the first place, was that the museum director recognized that this was something that they kind of needed to write at the museum. So this process obviously coerced and took advantage of families, so the Rehumanizing the Specimens project can really be seen as kind of a step toward justice for those people and their families. And some of the people from Central State Hospital represented in the specimen collection did not have mental illnesses, and the true nature of their conditions did not become apparent until they passed away, and an autopsy was performed on them at the pathological department. For example, one individual's symptoms were caused by a brain tumor, and Edward C's, who I just talked about on the last slide, was caused by a degenerative disease of the vessel walls in the brain. And these individuals didn't have access to modern medicine and technology, so they never learned about their diagnosis of the true nature of their illness when they were alive. So by including information about the autopsy findings, the narratives tell a fuller story of each person's life and serve as educational tools by allowing visitors to see how medical treatments for various illnesses have changed and adapted over time. So in this way, the specimens in the museum, we talked about this a lot in my class earlier today too, serve a purpose, an educational purpose beyond just being curiosities for people to come and see. And this picture here is in one of the upstairs rooms at the museum. The downstairs is that amphitheater that I showed you the picture of, and the anatomical museum. The upstairs, there's like a histology lab. Everything is very well preserved because kind of when the pathological department was abandoned, everything was just kind of left in its place. So it's really interesting to learn about how they did things back then. But this is in one of the upstairs rooms in the museum that sort of serves as like a library. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the implications this study has on other medical museums and on healthcare providers as well. So I'm going to start with museums. And ethical questions surrounding the display of human specimens recently caused the Mutter Museum, which is a medical history museum in Philadelphia, to remove all online content from their platforms. A post on the museum's website by the executive director states that the removed content will be reviewed by a panel of experts who will offer guidance about whether the videos serve the mission of the museum, that is, to facilitate health and well-being, and whether they meet best practices on the respectful exhibition of human remains. So this ethical review follows the growth and popularity of dark tourism. If you've heard of this before, this is when people visit locations that have been associated with death and suffering. And this thinking about dark tourism has given rise to discussions about whether it's ever ethical to put human remains on display for the public, and some question whether the displays are actually educational or whether they're merely a pandering to our base fascination with morbid thrills. So the narratives developed by the Rehumanizing the Specimens project sought to rehumanize and educate. I've mentioned a little bit about that so far. And the project was guided by questions like, What was their disease or injury like from their perspective? And how might their diagnosis, prognosis, or treatment be different today with the tools and technologies we have now? So in responding to these questions in the narratives, the museum provides the public with educational information about medical history, embodied experience, and advancements in general in medicine and technology. So this fascination with morbid thrills that I mentioned earlier became the focus of several recent Twitter discussions. So if you're into this kind of thing, you could really go down a rabbit hole of all kinds of interesting information that you can find about this. But I found a recent Twitter discussion that included one thread where a user posted a link to a blogger named La Carmina, her post about her visit to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. So the post contained several photographs of the blogger in a skull-patterned dress and tights, posing in front of the museum's human specimen display. So she's standing in front of it. You can see the human specimens in the background. So the Twitter user who shared the link commented that the blogger really seems to have no recognition of the humanity behind the specimens, or that the people represented by the specimens are just people and not part of some goth aesthetic. Those are her words from the tweet. In addition to discussing the ethics of visiting a museum's collection, the Twitter thread also points out multiple ethical issues with the Mutter Museum's collections, including that specimens may have been obtained by questionable means, and that the displays often resemble a freak show. That's in quotes, a word that she used as well, where visitors gawk at disabled bodies. So the Rehumanizing the Specimens project shows the power of language to rehumanize individuals who have experienced dehumanization. The Mutter Museum's ethical review might result in the removal of some of their specimens or maybe some of their exhibits, but those that remain could benefit from a similar approach to the Indiana Medical History Museum. I also visited over the summer. I was in Washington, D.C., and made a quick trip to Maryland to go to the National Museum of Health and Medicine. A lot of people give me a hard time that I left D.C. to go to a museum in Maryland, but it was a really cool museum, and a lot of the same things were going on there. There were some bones and other human specimens from the Civil War that had been obtained that you can go see there that had not necessarily been, someone provided consent for those to be there. Lots to think about and consider. But as the Twitter thread mentions, labels should be rewritten so that there's more transparency, right? So the museum visitors can know if specimens were donated with consent, how they came to obtain them. We were talking I was talking with you all yesterday, and you shared with me about the Johns bones. I talked about that in my class today. I was really fascinated by that. But one of the things we couldn't figure out by looking at that website was exactly how it says they were ethically obtained, right? But none of us could really figure out what exactly that meant, right? So it needs to be more transparency about where specimens come from, so the visitors know what they're seeing was ethically obtained. And labels should also help visitors recognize the humanity of the specimens by embracing the humanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos. This can be done by sharing information about the people represented by the specimens beyond just their illness or injury. And the specimens should be displayed with purpose. So if a museum's goal is to educate, then exhibits should clearly articulate what visitors can learn about medical history, about embodied experience, or about advancements in medicine and technology from those specimens. So this picture is just a cropped picture of the chalkboard that's in the amphitheater that I showed you. This is what is like behind the table, so kind of like the setup here. And someone just wrote some interesting things up there to make it look like unique to the time period. All right, so the strategies employed in the Rehumanizing the Specimens project can be applied to the contemporary study and practice of medicine as well. So while patients traditionally took a passive role in healthcare interactions, they have become more empowered in recent years due to technological advancements. These are things like wearable devices or smartphone sensors, and the increased availability of health information. I WebMD everything, whether or not that's healthy. But despite this shift, dehumanization in medicine still occurs, and while it's not always intentional, it can be detrimental to patients. So, for example, providers can de-individuate patients which involves thinking of them as part of a group. For example, people with depression or people with anxiety, rather than as individuals. And patients can also be dehumanized if providers objectify them or think of them only as a system of interacting parts when locating or diagnosing an illness or disease. And while these tactics can be useful at times, it's important for providers to remember that medicine is a humanistic field. There is no medicine without people. And patients should be treated as people rather than problems to be solved. Our medical system is not necessarily set up in a way that really facilitates that, but something to work toward. A more humanistic approach involves listening to and communicating with patients in a dignifying way, and the strategies used in the Rehumanizing the Specimens project can be adapted and used by healthcare providers. While rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos work to return dignity to people who have experienced dehumanization, providers can humanize patients in the moment, like during interactions or when discussing treatment options. For example, providers can ask patients personifying questions, like, what do you do for a living? To better connect with them or acknowledge patients' ethos by valuing their unique ways of knowing and being. They don't want to forget the other person in the healthcare interaction, which is the patient. So healthcare providers then, which is a term I'm using broadly to include anyone who is a provider in the health professions, can learn these humanizing communication strategies through educational programs that prioritize the human experience as it relates to illness and injury, suffering, grief, death, all of these things. So these programs, which include the medical humanities, overcome the separation of clinical care from the human sciences to foster interdisciplinary teaching and research to optimize patient care. So the medical humanities began forming in medical schools between the 1960s and the 1990s and experienced remarkable growth at the undergraduate level in the 2000s and beyond. And these programs work toward fostering a richer understanding of the human experience by bringing together the insights of many disciplines, including literature, philosophy, religion, history, art, bioethics, visual studies, and lots more. They help future providers become reflective, self-aware, exceptional communicators, and creative, critical, energetic thinkers. And empathy involves considering others' perspectives and experiences and has been linked to better positive clinical outcomes for patients. And this picture is just outside of the building near the medicinal garden, which they also have in the museum, which is really cool. It just gives a little bit of information about the old pathology building. So what are the takeaways from all of this? So the individuals represented by the specimens at the Indiana Medical History Museum, they experienced dehumanization for years in the Anatomical Museum, and while those individuals have been loved by their families, had unique and complex life experiences, the clinical labels reduced them to their illness or injury. The narratives developed through the Rehumanizing the Specimens project use rehumanizing rhetoric and recuperative ethos to dignify those individuals. And the power of language demonstrated through the museum's efforts can be harnessed by other medical museums and contemporary healthcare providers. So humans are inherently at the center of medical study and practice, so providers have a responsibility to listen, giving patients the opportunity to share their experiences and concerns, and communicate in a humanizing, empathetic way. And emphasizing the medical humanities and educational programs not only helps providers learn these skills and become more empathetic, but it allows them to see and understand unfortunate medical violations of the past. And some of these violations are illustrated by the Central State Hospital and the pathological department, including the poor treatment of individuals with mental illnesses and coercing families into giving consent for autopsies that they may not otherwise have consented to. So through reorienting medical study and practice to its humanity and understanding these violations of the past, they can be avoided in the future, hopefully. And one of the things that I just want to mention is that if you are going into nursing or health professions, or you're interested in this topic, learning more about this topic, we are in the process of establishing a medical humanities program here at USI. If everything goes well, we'll be launching in fall 2024. I do have more information about that if anybody's interested. I'll leave this up here. But here are my references, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so talk about the terms we're offering in exchange for allowing the autopsies of their loved ones' bodies, and you mentioned that it was kind of coercive. But today, most medical supplier facilities, people, organizations, companies who supply bodies to medical schools, to testing facilities, one of the selling points is still skip funeral costs because we pay for the transportation, involvement, and information and send it back to you. So, is it still coercive? Was it coercive because these people couldn't afford it? You know, or if they could have afforded it, but that just allowed them to not, was it still being coercive? Like, what makes it?
Yeah.
What makes one coercive and one not, or are they both coercive?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question given the context of in my body and art and culture class, we watched a documentary today on body building. And it only, I mean, it's terrifying. It was terrifying, right? Yeah, it was. And so one of the things that they highlighted in that documentary is there is no regulation on body donation in this country. And unfortunately, because of that, people have gotten away with quite a few unethical behaviors. So I think even if, the problem is even if those rules or guidelines are in place, like if you donate your loved one's body, we'll give this back to you. A lot of times they're not actually receiving their loved one's body parts back. One of the things we learned about in the documentary we watched today is that there was a funeral home that was taking bodies in and saying that they were cremating them and then giving the cremated remains back to the family members that actually turned out to be kitty litter. And then they were selling the bodies because it's a huge business, right? And so I think it said it was like $100 million business in the US right now. So they sold their bodies, and one person was talking about too, she donated her husband's body to be used for studies on alcoholism. And they ended up sending his body to the Department of Defense to be used in Humvee crash testing. And so, and I think she said she wasn't even sure if the remains that she ended up getting back from that were his, or maybe she said she didn't get them back at all. I can't remember exactly.
Since she got them back,
She's just not sure if it was him, right? And so I think in general, even if people say they're doing one thing, like she had said, this is what I want his body used for, and it wasn't used for that. So I think until we have some serious regulations in this country about the treatment of bodies after they've been donated, I think it all probably is fairly unethical, unfortunately. Yeah, but I would say, like, in the instance of the Medical History Museum, you know, I think that had these people been able to afford a funeral for their loved one, maybe they wouldn't have consented to this. And I certainly don't think that these families were probably told that their loved one's organs were then going to be on display in a museum. So it's just like, in general, an informed consent issue probably. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
I'm apologizing in advance. This is like a philosopher question, but I am one, so whatever. So it seems like the theory that you're using says to do right, the morally correct thing, we need to humanize them as individuals. But I wonder, like, why is the individuality the only thing that matters? So if the person is not here to still experience, right? Like justice for the families, I get that point. But it seems to be part of the focus of the museum is to help people understand disease, understand medical systems, understand those experiences. When we individualize them, right? When we just talk about the specific features of the person, but then we don't talk about, and I get, like, there's probably not the data, right? But we don't talk about how the illness was a part of their life, what that experience was like for them. Are we further silencing people and cutting people off from being able to share and understand and build community around the experience of the illness itself? Like, are we actually doing a disservice by what we're leaving out in terms of the shared commonalities with other people suffering from the same sorts of diseases now? Like, wouldn't it be better to include narratives from people now who have the disease as well to really tell the full picture? Because it's not just an individual who has the disease, right? It impacts whole communities.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and it makes me think, one of the things that I've been talking about, I talked about this with Caitlin and Richard both in the past week or so, about the Body Worlds exhibit, if you all have heard of this, the plastinated bodies that you can go see. It's kind of like a traveling exhibit, and they're like posed, doing different things, and you can kind of see the inside of the body and what that looks like. But with that, at least my understanding of it, and as I just said, clearly body brokering is a tricky business in this country, but with that, people donate their bodies directly to that cause, directly to the people, the Body Worlds people, to be used for that purpose. And so they're giving consent for their body to be used in that way. Whereas like the difference between that and this, I would say, is that these people and these families didn't necessarily, like the person didn't consent, the family consented, but maybe it was through sort of questionable means. And so I think the key is like, I think remembering the humanity of any human is important, but specifically in this situation where these people didn't really have much of a choice, I think it's important to like give a voice back to them. But the other thing I want to say too, what you mentioned, is they do talk about the person's experience of illness in the narratives like quite extensively actually, because they had quite a bit of information from the hospital admission records and from the records at the hospital that helped. And I think this was the most valuable thing for me visiting, is that I really did get to learn a lot about that person's experience of illness and what that was like for them. Which is why they were doing the autopsies to begin with, is that they wanted to be able to learn about that illness and experience and be able to help other people. So the individuality, I think you're right, is not the most important thing. But I think when someone's voice has been removed or they've been devalued in some way, like through an unethical process, maybe like this, I think it's important to try to give them back that voice as much as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just think there should be both, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to, because I think one of the things that's so, like, I don't know if you've ever read William Brody, but he talks about the phenomenology of illness, and one of the things that he thinks is, like, one of the bigger things people say again and again when they experience serious illness is how isolated they feel, right? And I think that by not also telling the story of people here and now who have similar experiences, you're not making that connection. Like, to me, that person is dead and gone. There is an issue of justice, but for me, I care about justice insofar as it matters here and now for people and their experiences now. And so I would just like to see, yes, tell me the story about this person. I want that, right? But I also want to hear the story that's shared of like what it's like for someone, people here and now, to experience the same thing.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it could be a really interesting thing to add on even to the narratives at the museum, to be able to include information about what that experience of illness would be like now, like how it would differ between what someone experienced during that time period. Yeah, I agree. This project, the Rehumanizing the Specimens project, took this small team of people 5 years working full time on it to do. And so I imagine it could potentially be a labor issue, but I think it sounds really interesting, and I would love to see that as well.
I started Mary Lynn's point a little bit more too, and I don't know if you have this information, but we talk about dark tourism in history all the time, and some of the collections of museums and public history and all this other stuff, and we know that the bodies that they have and the body parts they have are from disenfranchised communities, right? I think it was Harvard that recently said that it had like some millions of body parts of formerly enslaved people. There's a big project to return indigenous body parts to tribal nations. IU has actually got a pretty bad record for not returning things, I should say. And so I don't know how that applies to this museum. If you know the demographics, are these working class folks who, just had no voice in medicine? Are these disenfranchised communities, right? And I'm assuming that's probably part of the larger conversation in the literature too, right?
Yeah, I'm assuming so. I think just in general too, during this time period, the stigma associated with mental illness was not great. And so I imagine the people who were at this, and the Medical History Museum has information in their digital archive about this, where they are recognizing and acknowledging that the things that took place in the hospital and the pathological department were not kosher, right? They acknowledge that. And it's really interesting to read about some of the things that they thought about mental illness. And that's why the pathology department was developed, because they thought we're experiencing overcrowding, we have all these employees who are not well trained and who don't know how to help these people. And so they established this facility to do the autopsies, to learn more about mental illness, to be able to help those people. But as you mentioned, maybe did so a bit unethically or questionably. I do think that most of it did indicate on the labels, the new labels, the redeveloped narratives, the person's race. Most of them were white people. There was one African-American person, as far as I can remember, represented in the collection. But I do think in general, just from reading about the people in the narratives, like the one guy worked at a tile factory, for example, they were probably blue-collar workers for the most part, yeah. Which adds to the narrative of, were these people informed about what was happening to them? Were they treated ethically while they were in the hospital, and then afterward were their families educated on what was going on? Were they told what was going to happen to the body in this process, or were they just kind of like signing it away and hoping that they would just let them be able to use it? It's hard to say. But yes, I think it contributes to a larger conversation about the ethics.
Or even like the living conditions that led to higher rates of certain
Yeah.
diseases in some communities.
Right. And back during that time too, it was like if anybody started acting different in any way, they just were sent to the psychiatric facility because they just didn't really understand a lot or how the technology to test for other things or anything like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we have a couple of skeletons in the archaeology lab that were medical specimens at some point, but they were transferred over to Oddfellows lodges or fraternal organizations that they had a skeleton there as part of their Oddfellows rituals and everything, and they eventually wound up with us. And I mean, obviously these are anonymous individuals. We're never going to have any details about whether they worked at cow factories or whatever. And I think a lot of the medical specimens are in that category. So I think it's, in many cases, it'd be rather difficult to humanize them. I mean, when I use the skeletons for any type of construction or anything like that, I try to explain the circumstances of how they got to us and talk a little bit about, like, back then, the person died and they were indigent, they wind up as a medical specimen or something like that. And I kind of contextualize the whole thing as to how they got to where they're at nowadays. But other than that, we don't have any much chance of finding any kind of biographical details or anything about those kind of persons.
I thought that too when I was at the National Museum of Health and Medicine. I thought similar, like if these parts that are in the museum are from the Civil War era, likely maybe they don't have, and maybe they do, I don't know. But it seems unlikely that they probably have much information about them. But one of the things I will mention is I was having a conversation with Victoria and Alex yesterday, and we're archaeologists, and we're telling you about if I get any of this wrong, jump in. But they were doing some digging downtown and uncovered some graves that had been there for 200 years or so. And so they called you all in to unearth them and analyze them, right? And so my question to you yesterday was like, why are you doing this? Like, who does it benefit? Who does this information go to? And you said so nicely, like it just like goes with everything I'm talking about. You want to humanize them, right? That's what you said. And you don't know anything about them in terms of biographical information, but you're still taking the time to learn more about them and to lay the remains to rest in a place that's not under a road street and going through construction in downtown Evansville, right? So I would still say, even if you're not able to do some of the strategies that I was talking about here, there still are things that you can do to kind of work with it.
I try to frame it as best you can, try to make it known, like what the circumstances were and how that person arrived, where they're at, but other than that, there's not much you can say.
Right. Yes.
To quickly add on that, like Arizona State has developed, the museum's developed a ethical list of how to, at least for bioarchaeology for us specifically, in dealing with human skeletal remains, they have a vocabulary list of what you should and shouldn't use. And so one of the things we use in our reports, instead of saying maybe skeleton, we'll say
language to rehumanize. Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you into things?
Yeah, I forgot, sorry.
No, that's really fascinating.
later.
Yes, please do. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Do you, I mean, this is sort of related to what we've been talking about, but do you think that the people at the hospitals at the time, they thought that this was, by offering a burial, that was humanizing? Like that, because it was so rare at the time, maybe, or fewer people had burials. Do you think they, or was it just sort of cynical, like, oh, we're going to pay them off? I mean, your understanding, at least at that time.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, but one of the things we were talking about in my class today is like throughout history we've needed human bodies to learn things about science, but there've never been enough bodies. And so people have resorted to clearly unethical means to obtain them for the purposes of advancing science. I think that I think maybe both. I think they probably just needed bodies to do their research and to be able to learn more, and I think the intention behind it was noble. And they probably thought what you're saying, that by offering a funeral, this is my way of righting the situation or giving you something in return for allowing us to be able to do this. Yeah, probably. And our opinions and thoughts about bodies and donating bodies to science and these kinds of things have changed over time. Maybe it wasn't as widely accepted during this time as it will be now. So maybe they felt like they had to do that in order to get the bodies, I think, Melissa, you're going to first.
I just wanted to add a comment. I think your research is very timely because I think this idea of rehumanizing people is common across a lot of disciplines. In criminal justice, for example, they're not inmates anymore, guys. They're not inmates. They're incarcerated individuals. Or states are, instead of referring to offenders, right, changing the terminology to acknowledge the humanity that people have. And I think that's becoming common. It's for sure, and in my discipline, this is not, it's not everywhere yet, but it's definitely a movement that I've been noticing. And so there's actually a lot of interesting parallels because I also have the dark tourism interest with prisons. You can go to a lot of historic prisons on tours, and why do people go there? And where's Tamara Hunt? Because she's a student doing a dark tourism thing, I believe. Is that right? So
yeah, it is interesting. It brings up all kinds of conversations, like why are we so obsessed with true crime TV shows that they'll make 7 versions of the podcasts.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you, have you been to the Lunar Museum?
No, I haven't.
You have to.
I haven't been.
It seems like a perfect place for you to go.
Yeah.
And the things that you were saying about that people had said, I've been able to go there, and I mean, it is, right? Like, I think Freak Show is exactly why people go there. They think it's very interesting. I'm actually at a conference in Philly, was thinking maybe I would go again. But now I'm like, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe that's wrong.
It makes you feel like thank you for doing this. But I think one of the things that Sarah, the executive director at the Indiana Medical History Museum, one thing that she shared with me is that every year near Halloween, the Lunar Museum hosts like a Halloween party. And she said there has been some interest in Indianapolis of people asking them if they would do that, and she said never. We just aren't about that.
Eastern State Penitentiary does ghost tours.
They stopped that actually. I think they got involved in prison abolition, and I thought they shut down the haunted house a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been there in a few. I go every time my conference is there. Like, you got to go to Eastern State Penitentiary. But for years they did. I mean, it was a big money maker for them, And it's not. They're not the only one. I think it's common, and people obviously pay to go, or they wouldn't have these events.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a good segue from the last question. I'm kind of curious, when the museum opens itself up to a wider audience, not just medical professionals, was there anything questionable at that moment in terms of how they maybe decided to market themselves? Did they sort of present themselves, as come here to see all of these or report free shows?
I honestly don't know. Sarah, who's been there for, I think she said 14 years now, I'm not sure who was there before that, but I know since Sarah's gotten there, this has really been the focus of her efforts at the museum, is to try to work toward rehumanizing the specimens. So I'm not really sure. I don't know. It is a very small museum in like the middle of a weirdly like industrial feeling part of Indianapolis, like you just are driving and you think you're in the middle of nowhere, and then all of a sudden there's a medical museum. So I imagine they probably have to do some marketing, or they had to do some marketing just for people to know that they exist and they're there, but I'm not really sure what that looked like. It's a good
And
question.
when was that when they opened themselves up?
1969.
Okay, yeah, so I'm just curious how they sort of presented, a world of people now.
And I'd be curious, related to that, right, like about, do they need the admission fees to maintain the museum? So where does their funding come from? And I think maybe this would apply in a lot of contexts. Do they have to advertise it as a free show to get people to come and pay money so that they can maintain what they have?
I imagine, just based on my conversations with Sarah, I think that they would resist that, and also based on their building is a little bit falling apart. They have received some grant funding to help fix it up, but it is a historic building. It's been there since, I forget what I said, 1845 or something like that. So it is quite old, and it hasn't been as well kept up over the years. And so the building is kind of crumbling around them. I know they've been able to do some things to fix it up, but I think the admission fees for the tours probably go toward that, I imagine. But I do know they also rely on grant funding for those kinds of things, yeah. And they also have a connection and relationship with the Indiana University Medical School in Indianapolis that kind of helps them maintain the specimens. Like they'll come and take them every so often and like refill the fluid and kind of like take care of them and bring them back. She said it's a very nerve-wracking process to like load these really old specimens into someone's vehicle to be taken to, but yeah, but it's like part of the upkeep process, yeah. So they do have people around that help them. Yeah.
I know I asked one, but just on the morbid thrills question, because you're someone who specializes in meaning, I wonder what people think morbid thrills covers, right? Because on the one hand, I've definitely been to museums where you see human specimens, and I think the attitude of people is like, well, that's not me, I'm awesome, they suck because they're dead here and I'm not. But I also had a student not too long ago who was dying, she knew she was dying, and she very much identified as God, right? And God was like a way for her to feel less alone in the world, and like she was used to like confronting death in the face, and her body is fragile. And so like, does morbid thrills cover both of those categories? Is there like a separate terminology for maybe something that's less morally dubious and maybe just a way of working through human curiosity without our own inevitable deaths?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. One of the things we talked about this week in my body and culture class is this concept. We did this reading that said that zombie films, we love them so much because they help us grapple with our own and think about our own mortality. So I do think that there's value in that as well. And I don't think that every single one of these museums or these like organizations that you can go see these human specimens are like playing into that morbid thrills. But I do think that transparency is key, and I think it's really important for these specimens that are being on display. Either the museum, I think, has a responsibility to be forthright about how they've been obtained, or information about who donated it. Like, there was an instance at the Muir Museum where this man had a heart transplant, and he donated his old heart to the museum. It was on display, and they took it down. And he was actually really upset by that. And they took it down because they're doing this review process. But he was really upset by that. He said, I donated it. I want it to be on display because I want people to be able to learn from it. So I think there's a difference in like going and learning about the things that you're talking about. I think that is something as humans that we're interested in learning more about and kind of confronting and grappling with. But it feels better to do that when the specimens have been obtained in an ethical way, or informed consent is given, right? Like if that person had wanted to donate her body parts to a museum, like the museum could say these were obtained in this way, and maybe share a bit about the person if that was something that they wanted, right? And so then I think it's not necessarily playing into those morbid thrills as it's much like a learning experience from a human specimen that was donated.
Is there a term for that other attitude, that fascination, but not with the morbid thrills negative connotation?
Yeah, I don't know. Yes, probably. Leslie, do you have an idea, a response to this? Or you have another question?
I have another.
Okay, we'll be thinking about it. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
I was wondering what you would say to the people who would like do this presentation and say like, is this really a pertinent idea? Like, I know for a fact that I'm going to go home and I'm going to tell my dad about this really cool new thing I learned about, and he's going
why do you care? Like, because to some people, like, this doesn't seem worth their time almost.
Yeah.
Like, even just like simple things like calling someone by the correct pronoun isn't their thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, what would you say to the people who, like, this doesn't seem very important to them at all?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question because it does take a lot of time and effort. Clearly, it took them 5 years to even put these narratives together. And your question is kind of like, would someone question whether or not that time was well spent, right? Or that grant money that went toward using or developing these narratives, was that really well spent? I think it just comes back to, I mean, one of the things that we talked about in class was just that I think it's easy to sort of disembody individuals that you don't have a connection to, but I would sort of bring it back to like, what if this was your loved one, right? We talked about that with the video that we watched today too. Like, it's one thing to see all of this happening to these bodies, but I think it's another thing to think about, what if this happened to someone who was cherished by me, a loved one, a family member, right? And maybe that would make them feel more apt to feel a connection to what's happening here. But the other thing is, I think that one of you said this, but it's like this idea of like, well, that person's dead, they're gone, they don't know what's going on, right?
Oh, that was me.
You said that thing. You also, I think, said you would donate your body to science too, right?
No, I said I
You said you would do it if they paid your family money to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, my dead body might as well be making a little bit of cash.
But if you consented to that, if that's something you want to do, I think that that's totally okay if that's something that you want to do. But I think bringing it back to like, if this was someone that you had loved while they were alive, would you be okay with that treatment of them?
Right.
Maybe see if that has an impact.
I think I might pop in like, how do you like it when you're in the hospital and they treat you like an object? Like, this is part of how that happens.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that too, like thinking about like, as a person who is going to have an illness or an injury someday, if not already, how would you want your healthcare team to approach you and treat you and talk to you? Yeah, another way to frame it.
Just a quick edit, like we get asked that all the time when we're excavating communities, like downtown Evansville is cold summer, as how we all know.
Yeah.
What makes it there, like compare is looking for people that actually have family and care. So we're the ones that are helping them get to their clients.
Yeah, you're acting on behalf.
Somebody's like scared, so that's
Yeah. If these people, for example, if you didn't hear what she said, that have been in the ground for 200 years, like they're sort of acting on behalf of their loved ones that aren't around anymore and are treating those people with the care and respect that they deserve because they were human beings, right? Yeah.
Okay, so with museums that already have, you know, specimens and artifacts on display, have them in their collection. We think about this with science and art and everything. If you go back any amount of time in science, there's been some shady things that have happened, but we've gotten great advancements with them.
Yeah.
And we don't throw out those advancements in science when we acknowledge the shady stuff
Yeah.
went down with it. But we acknowledge that. With these museums, I think it's better to remove artifacts that we don't know about the provenance of, or we know for a fact were obtained unethically, or is it better to leave them on display with the acknowledgement that either we don't know where this came from, or this is a practice that is out of practice now, sort of like movies now that they will say this depicts something that wasn't okay then and isn't okay now, but it's the way things were done.
Right. That's an interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer to. A lot of the readings I did had varying responses to that. I posed the question to my class this morning, and I don't think we ever came to an answer of what we thought about that. But some of the readings that I did, like the Twitter thread that I referenced, she said it's okay to leave the specimens on display as long as the museum is transparent about how they were obtained and provides information like you mentioned. And I did some readings that said if they were obtained in an unethical way, they should be taken down and buried, right? I don't know what the right answer is. As someone who loves medicine and learning about medicine, and when I go to the Indiana Medical History Museum, I love being there because it's such an interesting learning experience. And every time I go there, I see something or learn something new. So I want to say that, like, I like that museums like this exist because I can learn something from it. But at the same time, I feel questionable even saying that, you know. So I don't know what the right answer is. But I do think, at the very least, museums have a responsibility to be forthcoming about their collections, yeah, which is what the Hoover Museum is doing, which is great, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have one more.
No, it's okay.
Because when we've been talking here, now I think, what about altruism in this, right? Where do these medical, the way people donate their bodies or kidneys, is that part of any of the discussion in these things? Like the idea of altruism, like in the way that Mary Lynn was saying, like you're helping out other people by donating your body to this.
Yeah.
And that there is an element of altruism in that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think that is part of this because I think the thing that I'm kind of making an argument about is like there are good things that can come from people who donate their organs, who donate their bodies to science. But then as the people who are handling those things after they're gone, we have an ethical responsibility to handle them and honor them in a way that respects their humanity. And that wasn't really happening then, and it's really not happening now. I mean, organ donation is probably different, but body donation, I should send y'all a link to this body appropriate film we watched today. It's atrocious because there's just no regulation on what happens to these people. And even people who, before they die, say, I want to donate my body to this purpose, once it's handed off to the company that purchased the body, they can do whatever they want with it, really. So yeah, I think it's so nice that people think I want to be part of the advancement of science, but then like that is a responsibility for people that are still around to take care of them and honor them. Yeah.
One last thing. Sorry, but consenting, saying I want my body donated to science is not saying you're consenting to have your body on display.
Right.
So
Yes.
those are very different things.
Right.
And so I feel like maybe that got a little lost, but I've been thinking that as some of these other comments.
So I'm glad you brought that up. So in the documentary that we watched today, there is this place called, is anyone left from my morning class? Skulls Unlimited?
Yeah,
No, Skulls Unlimited, okay. And it's in Oklahoma, right? And they have a museum of osteology connected to this business. And so mostly they do taxidermy, but they also have human specimens in their collections, and they have put several of them in this museum on display. And the interviewer asked this guy who runs the museum, did the people who donated their bodies to science know that you were going to put them on display? And he said, well, I assumed that they knew that was an option, and that's not what he asked, right? So the answer is no, they didn't know. They just knew in general, my body's being donated to science, and hoping that it goes to something helpful, not just being on display somewhere. So yeah, I think that absolutely adds to the informed consent discussion. Yeah.
So minor thing, not a question, but Mary Lynn's question about is there a nicer way to say morbid curiosity? I just thought of thanatology, study of death and how terminal illnesses affect humans and their families. Thanatological interest?
How do you spell? Is it you're saying thanatological? Thanatological. Okay, gotcha. I love that. I'm going to title something.
Create the word.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Melissa, for starting with that. So I want to mention that thank you all for coming to our first talk this semester. Our next one is scheduled for 3 o'clock on October 27th with Dr. Casey Hoyer Davis. The title of this presentation will be The South African Indian Muslim Hindu Divide and the Formation of the State of Israel. And with that, we will conclude. Have a great week.